Hi, my name is Adam Greenfader. I'm the managing partner at AG&T, currently the chair of the Urban Land Institute Caribbean Council. And I'm really proud here today to be with Manuel Laboy, Secretary of Economic Development of Puerto Rico. How's it going, Manuel?
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for this opportunity.
Well, we're definitely living in historic times, and I can think of no better person to be talking about manufacturing and bringing manufacturing back to the United States than Manuel. Manuel, can you give us a little background about your experience and your educational formation?
Certainly. So I am a professional chemical engineer by trade. I have over 20 years plus of experience in the private sector. I actually was able to perform as an engineer in the beginning of my career and was very proud about it. I really liked it. And then eventually started to have other types of experiences in the manufacturing sector, pharmaceutical, medical devices. I also had experience in infrastructure projects associated with renewable energy, natural gas, projects associated with power, also water and water treatment facilities. And then at some point, I had the chance to, for the first time, to be in the government, in the public sector, back in 2012. My first exposure to economic development when I served as Assistant Secretary for 1 year. And that gave me an opportunity to have a broader sense of the economics and how economic development works. I spent a few years back in the private sector as a consultant, doing project management in different fields, including the healthcare sector, information technology, and so forth. And then at the end of 2016, the governor-elect then, Rosselló, gave me a once-in-a-lifetime chance to be the Secretary of Economic Development and Commerce. So I've been in this role officially since January 2017. And I have to say that it's been an incredible ride, an honor to be a public servant, and of course, very challenging times. When we got into the office, there were already challenges for Puerto Rico, economic and fiscal crisis. There was PROMESA that was approved by Congress in 2016, a new fiscal board. We were managing SICA in 2016 that also have an impact in the tourism industry. And then when we got into 2017, we were managing those things. The governor of Puerto Rico filed bankruptcy. Then we have the two hurricanes in 2017, which caused major devastation. 2018, 2019, we were in the right course for recovery. And then we experienced a political crisis last summer in 2019. We have a new governor. And then early 2020, we experienced the earthquakes in the Southwest, and now the pandemic associated with COVID-19. So it has been major challenging times, but I still feel very optimistic about the prospects for Puerto Rico. I think that the resiliency that we had basically developed because of all this crisis is going to pay off at some point in the near future for Puerto Rico.
Everything you just said it sounds like some science fiction novel. All the trials and tribulations that you have kind of been commandeering and mastering. So you're the head of economic development. We're in this crisis today, the COVID-19 crisis, and everybody's talking about bringing manufacturing back to the United States / Puerto Rico. Do you think that this is something that Puerto Rico can do?
Absolutely. I believe that Puerto Rico is probably, if not one of the best, or probably the best location under the U.S. flag to contribute to national security. National security right now, it's more relevant and critical than ever. Not because of this COVID-19 crisis. There's been, numerous other situations that merit that we strengthen national security as a nation. Puerto Rico is part of the U.S. So of course, now that we are going through this unprecedented, challenging pandemic, things are changing. It's going to be a new world, a new geopolitical landscape. The economics are changing. And one of those things include the need to depend less on foreign sources for critical goods for the US. And that includes pharmaceuticals, that includes drugs, that includes medical devices, that includes personal protective equipment, and many other related goods that are considered essential for the US. Puerto Rico has a long history for manufacturing. We have to go back to the old days of Operation Bootstrap in the 1940s, 1950s. Then eventually we had experience in the petrochemical industry. Then we had the 936 in the 1970s. And with that, a wave of pharmaceutical companies in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico became probably one of those top centers in the world for pharmaceutical manufacturing. At the phase out of 936, there were some changes in terms of the companies that were doing business in Puerto Rico, but somehow, and for various reasons, we were able to retain a core set of pharmaceutical operations in the island. And we have the track record, we have the talent, we know how to manufacture according to the most strict regulations and quality assurance regulations. We offer great incentives. We're well located. So Puerto Rico, it's probably, I have to say, the most advantageous location within the US flag to fulfill that national security requirement. And of course, as part of those activities, promote economic development and growth in Puerto Rico.
So you mentioned that Puerto Rico is ideally positioned and that its labor force is ideally positioned for manufacturing. Can you be a little bit more specific? I mean, what makes Puerto Rican manufacturing labor so ideal for our viewers who are, many of them, owners of manufacturing plants?
Yes. So let's go through the numbers first. Puerto Rico right now has 49 FDA approved pharmaceutical facilities across the island. The good thing about it is that, there are, of course, certain technological corridors, but for the most part, pharmaceutical activity is well spread throughout the island. Number one. Number two, we have a strong supply chain. The supply chain that also has local companies, local capital, local companies that are part of that supply chain, along with other companies that are multinationals that also provide goods and services for these 49 FDA-approved pharmaceutical facilities. More and more, there is synergies between pharmaceutical industry and medical device industry and other industries as well, like, for example, knowledge services. And those things have been able to put Puerto Rico in a path to diversify the different aspects and the spectrum of pharmaceutical activity. So it's not only manufacturing, but we're talking about clinical trials, research and development. We're talking about, sophisticated services. We're talking about back-end services. There's a number of things, validation and engineering, quality assurance, quality control. Those things are part of what Puerto Rico offers today. Certainly, when you look at Puerto Rico's footprint 20, 30 years ago, we used to have a bigger landscape of pharmaceuticals because of the conditions back then. Let me give you an idea. In the 1996, we used to have 160,000 plus employees directly related to manufacturing, most of them pharmaceutical. Today, we have roughly 74,000. And when you look at the indirect and the induced jobs, it really represents close to 220,000, which is about a quarter of all the jobs that we have in Puerto Rico. So it's still a very solid industry, despite of all the challenges that we have went through over the last 20, 30 years. And I don't think that people never anticipated that we were going to go through such a COVID-19 pandemic. So within a crisis, there comes opportunities. And now Puerto Rico, I think, is well positioned. So when you look at the workforce, let me give you an example. Puerto Rico graduates at least 1,000 engineers every year. 1,000 engineers. We're talking about 20 to 25,000 STEM-related graduates every year that somehow are related to, science, technology, mathematics, and so forth. So even though we've been going through some out-migration issues over the last 15 years, and the reality is that we have lost a percentage of our population, we still manage to produce enough talent to fulfill the needs of the local labor market, specifically in the pharmaceutical sector. Now that we can anticipate that Puerto Rico can be that place that we can get that new activity coming from China or India or any other foreign countries, and that onshoring back to the US, I think that we are positioned to address any labor needs associated with that new activity.
I appreciate you giving us those numbers. I've not heard numbers like that before. And staying on the numbers, what are today the total amount of manufacturing plants in Puerto Rico versus in 2006 with the expiration of Act 936?
So today, in terms of manufacturing, according to the North America industry system, the codification system, we have about 1,700 manufacturing companies in Puerto Rico. That covers basically the whole manufacturing spectrum. And of those, I will say that maybe 200 are somehow related to life sciences. So we have 49 FDA approved plants for pharmaceutical activity. We have maybe around 70 plants associated with medical devices. And then you have an amount related to supply chain, where there are goods or services for those companies. In terms of what we used to have in 2006, maybe 1996, when the whole phase out of 936 started, I don't have the specific number of companies, but you can compare based on employment, right? So direct jobs in 1996, like I said, it was close to 160,000 direct jobs. In 2020, we have about 74,000 direct jobs. It looks a decline because it is a major decline. But what we have seen also is that there's been a shift in terms of how companies do outsourcing, right? So we have a lot of companies that have indirect jobs and also outsource recruiting of personnel. So those 74,000 doesn't include those outsourcing tendencies in terms of how these companies behave in the 21st century in terms of human resources and recruiting.
I appreciate you clarifying that for us. So in addition to this very capable workforce and well-educated and continually well-educated workforce, what's the cost of the Puerto Rican workforce when we look at other US states?
That's a very good question. Puerto Rico, in the manufacturing sector, the average income, it's around $40,000 annual compensation. That is in the whole manufacturing sector. When you look at the specific subsector of pharmaceuticals, that number goes up, right? And we might be looking at a range between, $50,000 to $60,000, depending on the specifics, but that is a good number to use. That is probably 20-30% less than the major hubs of pharmaceutical activities in the US mainland, like compared to New Jersey, compared to Massachusetts, maybe compared to California, and other areas in the US that had a strong pharmaceutical presence. We're still very competitive. And let me tell you something, $60,000 annual payroll in Puerto Rico, annual compensation, is not a bad number. I mean, in Puerto Rico, the cost of living is a little less depending on how you see it. We see a lot of companies that are away from the metropolitan area. So when you are located, let's say in the east coast of Puerto Rico or the west coast or in the mountains or the south or the north, away from San Juan, the quality of life varies, right? And the cost of living also varies. So $60,000 is a good compensation, especially if you're away from the metropolitan area. And I think that puts us in a very competitive advantageous position compared to, of course, some of the major hubs in the US mainland.
Oh, so that's fabulous. So well-trained workforce, well-educated workforce, about 20 to 30% less expensive than in the US. And I just recently spoke to a high-level ex-governor who mentioned that the quality and the longevity of the workforce in manufacturing, because Puerto Rico is an island, because Puerto Rico has a culture of being very dedicated to employers, longer, that employees tend to stay longer at their jobs in manufacturing in Puerto Rico than other places. Any thoughts or comments on that?
I totally agree with that statement. And as a matter of fact, prior to the hurricanes of 2017, the turnover rate was very low in those sectors, in the pharmaceutical sector, in the medical device sector, biotechnology sector. As a matter of fact, we're seeing that in those high-end sectors like aerospace, for example, export services, the turnover is very low, specifically in the pharmaceutical sector. But interesting enough is that after Maria, as everybody knows, the electrical infrastructure collapsed. And the telecommunication system also suffered major destruction. So in the first 3 months, in the pharmaceutical industry needed to rely specifically on their contingency plans. We're talking about emergency generators and other alternative ways, to generate electricity, and of course, the redundancy plans associated with telecommunications. The majority of the companies that we were able to get information, they were able to start operations again with certain limitations, of course, maybe a week or 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria. And they were able to export goods to the major markets from Puerto Rico, including pharmaceuticals, which, by the way, 10% of all the pharma-related drugs that are consumed in the US are produced in Puerto Rico. 10%. So imagine a day after Maria, one of the first calls that we received that I personally took was from the FDA commissioner. Because a lot of people in the US just didn't know how strong Puerto Rico pharmaceutical industry was and still is. And of course, there was a major national security issue in terms of ensuring that pharmaceutical products still were produced in Puerto Rico to serve the global market, specifically the U.S. market. And like I said, many of those, or probably the majority of those facilities, were able to came back online in a week or 2 weeks. And imagine that those employees were suffering at the personal level. Many of them lost homes. Many of them were going through a very tough time and still show up to work. The level of loyalty, the commitment and the passion of the Puerto Rican workforce, specifically in those sectors, it was just incredibly proven to be right there on point in the most needed time. And I can tell you stories about CEOs, VPs, COOs, CFOs from all these major companies that traveled to Puerto Rico for the course of 1 year after Maria. They didn't want any recognition, completely under the radar, and they just came to Puerto Rico and visited those facilities because they wanted to shake the hand of the employees that actually, even though they were going through all this personal situation, they were able to go to work and ramp up facilities and operations in less than a week. And that is incredible. That has become, the commitment and the loyalty of our workforce has become a new incentive, a new factor in terms of our value proposition when we compare to other jurisdictions, because even in the most desperate times, we were able to get people to work, and they did it with passion and they did it with commitment.
That's a very heartwarming and inspirational story, Manuel, and I'm really happy that you shared that. When people think about Puerto Rico, they always think about the electrical grid and challenges that it has, and we're all aware that there improvements need to be made, but very few times do we hear about the water infrastructure and the availability of water in Puerto Rico, which for anyone that's in the manufacturing space knows how important that is. Can you talk a little bit about Puerto Rico's access to water and availability?
Yes, you just hit a very important point as well. So of course, electricity is a critical infrastructure component for all industries in Puerto Rico, from tourism to manufacturing to agriculture to everything else. In the case of water, for years, probably it was a little overlooked. And now water, not only in Puerto Rico, water is one of the most important commodities, probably the most important commodity in the world. And in Puerto Rico, there's no exception. So Puerto Rico has gone through some drought seasons over the course of the last 20, 30 years. But it's never really been an issue of availability of water. It's about distribution of water, okay? So we do have plenty sources of water, and the major issues from the infrastructure standpoint is really the need to better, transmission and distribution of water according to the infrastructure that we have. Fortunately, I think that there's been some great news over the last 2 years because the water aqueduct and aqueduct authority has undergone a restructuration in terms of its debt, major obligations associated with EPA and USDA grants and debt have been able to successfully, being addressed. So I think that Puerto Rico's water system is in a good position for new capital that is really needed, to take the system to the next level. And we're talking about having a state-of-the-art water filtration facilities, water treatment facilities, which today, they are working, they are in compliance with environmental requirements and so forth. But of course, there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think now we have the capital, and of course, with the recovery efforts and the recovery funds associated with that, I think we're going to be able to put Puerto Rico in the path to, for the next years, to do the necessary investments in terms of the water infrastructure. And that also applies, of course, for the electrical grid as well, and everything associated with the electrical infrastructure.
So as the world starts to bring back its manufacturing, and the US in particular starts to bring manufacturing back home, and hopefully some of that comes back to Puerto Rico, what challenges do you see, in particular on the federal tax code, that we all in the private industry can get behind and try to change or improve? I mean, I've heard the GILTI provision might encumber industries that want to be in Puerto Rico from the 2017 Tax Act. Can you explain a little bit more about that and your thoughts?
Yes, this is a very, very critical discussion. We have to see this at two tiers. We have the federal tier, which basically covers the whole US, and you have the Puerto Rico tier, right? The local tier. In terms of the federal tier and everything that will apply, generally speaking, to the 50 states and territories, I believe that the federal government needs to present a solid package in terms of incentives that will benefit the whole U.S. Landscape, right? Because there's a reason why many of these companies went overseas in the first place, right? For many, many years, they were looking to lower cost of production. They were trying to, be competitive in most instances. So there was a trend over the last couple of years and decades, that were basically moving a lot of operations away from the being manufacturing under the U.S. flag to other places, right? So I think that the 2017 tax code overhaul, as a U.S. as a whole, right, is in the right direction because it lowered basically the liability associated with the taxes. But I think it will require more under these new circumstances, right? Because it's national security oriented. And I think that the US needs to ensure that it really offers very attractive incentives to ensure that that trend is reversed and all these companies come back on shore to the US as a whole, right? And Puerto Rico being part of the US. Now, when you look at and as a matter of fact, when you look at Resident Commissioner's bill that she presented, it goes in that direction, right? It's really not for Puerto Rico per se. It's really for the U.S. Of course, certain criteria that will put Puerto Rico, of course, in an advantageous situation compared to other jurisdictions within the U.S. flag. But the approach is let's bring back manufacturing to the U.S. and Puerto Rico being part of that. Now, the Puerto Rico tier is a little bit more complicated because, as you mentioned, the 2017 tax reform established a tax that is called the GILTI tax, among other related taxes, but this is the most significant one, Global Intangible Low Tax Income, or GILTI, which basically establishes a new tax associated with intellectual property and licensing, and not to get into the into the specifics. And Puerto Rico, because it's not part of the U.S. tax code, for those purposes, is being treated as a foreign country. And that established basically a new liability on the U.S.-based companies that are doing business in Puerto Rico as foreign entities, right? There's a term for that which I forgot. But the point I want to make is this: we've been able to navigate that since the end of 2017, and for the most part 2017, because we do have also certain mechanisms like the excise tax that we pay in Puerto Rico, and that they get full credit at the federal level, which is called the 154 excise tax. Because of the guilty and because of the U.S. tax reform, all those things have been changing, and there's new regulations from the IRS and Treasury in terms of how U.S.-based companies basically claim tax credits based on foreign income and foreign income sources. So we've been having all these discussions with the U.S. Treasury, with the IRS for the last 2-3 years. Well, for the last 2 years, most likely, more concentrated, in order to find a way that Puerto Rico and U.S.-based companies in Puerto Rico complying with the U.S. tax provisions, but also remain competitive. And also we keep the system to collect right now the income that we get from 154. So that triangle between U.S. Federal requirements, the 154 in Puerto Rico, getting those revenues for the local government, and at the same time maintaining the conditions in Puerto Rico so those companies can stay in the island because we're competitive. That's exactly what we're working for the last year and a half, right? And then COVID-19 came along, right? So what's going to happen next on that particular scenario remains to be seen. But what I think is going to happen is that we are going to see this in the different set of lens, right? The IRS and Treasury, my view is that now is before and after COVID-19, and because of what's happening in terms of bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., including Puerto Rico, might affect the way we've been seeing these things, especially the IRS and Treasury. So what's going to happen, with those specific things, it's hard to predict. But from my perspective, things are changing. It's a new world, it's a new scenario, and that opens up, opportunities to look at this from a different perspective.
Just to be clear, you mentioned, I believe it was HR 6443 is the resolution that you mentioned. That's Jennifer Gonzalez's resolution.
That's right. That's the one. Yes.
And it's my understanding that this resolution is for any economically depressed location, not just necessarily Puerto Rico, correct?
That is correct. Yes. Which we believe is a good approach. Again, we see ourselves as part of the U.S., right? So we believe that the whole idea of bringing manufacturing is back to the U.S., right? Of course, when you look at Puerto Rico, and on that definition, Puerto Rico will probably have an advantageous position compared to other U.S. jurisdictions. And on top of that, I think that there's no other U.S. territorial state that has all the ingredients for what it takes to really be successful in pharmaceutical production.
Well, it just seems like a win-win, especially in light of Puerto Rico's current economic situation. It was really the end of manufacturing 936 that brought on the devise and the debt of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is well suited to do manufacturing. It was for almost 50, 60 years the manufacturing hub of the world. So it makes a lot of sense to bring it back, and it kind of is a win-win for everybody, for the United States, for Puerto Rico, for the people most of all. I know you're very busy, and I want to just take a few last minutes to talk about some other acts that are that are going on in Puerto Rico that might affect manufacturing. I mean, we've got Opportunity Zone that just happened recently. And do you see any relationship between Opportunity Zone and manufacturing? I mean, is there advantages that can be had through that act?
I think so. There may be some opportunities for certain new projects or expansion projects that are trying to raise capital, and looking at the opportunity zones might be one way to address their capital stack needs for those investments. But the more I see it is that, remember that we offer local incentives for opportunity zone projects Plus, you have, of course, the different incentives that are offered at the federal level. So you might have investors that are trying to have their realized capital gains and place them in good bets in terms of projects that provide great rate of return. And those may have an opportunity to look at some of the projects that we may have in the pharmaceutical industry that have specific needs, the way they structure, their finance and the way they structure the capital stack. That may be a possibility. From the local incentives perspective for opportunity zones, they will not qualify because they're already covered by another law, which used to be Act 73, which is now part, of course, of the new incentives code. And what used to be Act 73, now part of Act 60 of 2019, does provide even more attractive incentives than opportunity zones for the most part. So what I believe is what's going to happen is that you see a lot of synergies, right? Synergies between sectors. Manufacturing is important that it grows, but in order for manufacturing to grow, you also need other sectors as well to be aligned in terms of growth. So you will need residential projects, you will need commercial projects, you need the tourism industry to also get back on track, and also provide the necessary growth for Puerto Rico in the tourism sector. The tourism sector drives new visitors, so it means that it drives more air routes and more air connectivity that also addresses the needs for the private sector in other industries like pharmaceuticals. So there's a lot of synergies going on. When it comes down to local incentives, I think we're pretty covered, and we offer probably the best, more competitive incentives. Not only, I will say that in the world that we're very competitive, but within the U.S. mainland, certainly we are, way ahead in terms of putting together a package that makes sense for these companies to come to Puerto Rico. I think that to that point, the most important thing that we need to do right now is precisely to promote, educate, and market Puerto Rico. Because a lot of people, they just don't know that we offer those incentives. A lot of people just don't know that we have an incredible workforce, that we graduate 1,000 engineers, that we have 49 FDA-approved plants. I mean, the history and the capabilities, our value proposition, sometimes we think that people know. Well, the truth of the matter is that a lot of people just don't know. Starting in the US, and education, promotion, marketing of Puerto Rico is going to be very important to raise the awareness. So Puerto Rico is right on the radar of all these companies that are going to be making decisions to come back to the US.
Well, you guys have certainly done an amazing job promoting Puerto Rico in the last couple of years. I mean, the creation of the DMO and Invest Puerto Rico, we can see this here in mainland. I'm in Miami, and we see the results of you guys putting Puerto Rico to the forefront. I just recently read on LinkedIn that there's been some new flights that have been approved for Puerto Rico, and that you guys just continue to bring the island to top of mind. I'd just like to take the last question in terms of another program that I think has been very successful and is well written, and that's the public-private partnerships, the PPPs, that Puerto Rico for years has had, in our opinion, the business community has really been exceptional. Can you talk a little bit about that, and specifically the unsolicited PPPs?
Yes. It is unfortunate that we've been having some, major delays because of this crisis, right? But I'll tell you that there's about maybe 7 to 8 projects that are way in advance in the public-private partnership process, and they came from the unsolicited proposal mechanism. Some of them are related to energy, others are related to other industries, and we expect that once we advance in reopening the economy little by little, of course, through the COVID-19 crisis, we're going to get back on track on those processes as well. So hopefully before the end of the year, some of these projects will be able to finalize from the perspective of the due diligence and the process that they need to complete. That includes, I said, energy. Also, others are associated with tourism. There's a couple of projects also related to transportation. And I think that they are going to be very important messages out there that this framework works, that this framework really puts Puerto Rico in the path for being to be open for business. And we need to ensure that we finalize those processes. And if you add that to the fact that recently the U.S. Department of Transportation approved a waiver for Puerto Rico. So we can now bring international flights to the island for 3 major airports: San Juan, Aguadilla, and Ponce. And now this waiver allows these international flights to stop in one of those airports and then allow transfer of air cargo and passengers between carriers. This is the first time in the history of Puerto Rico that the U.S. Department of Transportation allows this waiver, grants these rights. The Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, and Alaska, they also have these waivers, but only for air cargo. So Puerto Rico is the first U.S. jurisdiction that, in addition to air cargo, now we also have for passenger transfer for international flights. And that is a game changer. So we expect that to have an impact in terms of international trade, international commerce, transportation, and also tourism, and also manufacturing, because it will allow to maximize as well, let's say, free trade zones, international distribution, maybe build, storage facilities. I mean, it just opened up a number of possibilities for Puerto Rico. We have a 2-year window. This is very standard for U.S. Department of Transportation. They grant these waivers for 2 years. Same thing for Guam, same thing for Alaska. So every 2 years, we need to submit an application for renewal. So in that sense, everybody's in the same boat. But I think that now with this new tool, we got to work together. The public sector and the private sector, NGOs, Invest Puerto Rico, Discover Puerto Rico, everybody work together so we can market this new tool throughout the rest of the world, so we can attract those airlines and those activities to Puerto Rico.
We're on it, Manuel. Thank you so much for your time and your dedication. You have been there through all the trials, and I'm excited to see the results in the weeks and days and months to come when you get Puerto Rico back on its feet. And really, from all of us at the Urban Land Institute, thank you for spending some time, and stay safe.
Thank you. You too. Thank you for the opportunity. Stay safe.